welcome to today's Ramblogue. So this is a bit of an odd one because it's circumstances allow me to talk about a thing that I'm pretty sure no one who is currently subscribed to this channel cares about. But I'm going to talk about it anyway because we're at a cross section. So people listen to a lot of our podcasts know I'm quite passionate about F1. I watch F1 religiously and follow it reasonably closely, and I've often been a fan and supporter of Drive to Survive, which is the Formula One documentary that they've been airing on Netflix for the last few years. So because of the crossover of the sport I like and television, I've actually got an opportunity to talk about it. Now, I do like this documentary series, and I do recommend it because I do think it's gotten a lot of people into the sport. I think it's very user-friendly, very accessible way to sort of understand the ins and outs of Formula One. They do, for someone who watches a lot of it, it's, they explain things like, well, where you finish in qualifying will determine how many cars are in front of you when you start the race tomorrow. And it's like, yeah, I mean, they do occasionally say things like that, and it's just like, okay, yeah, fair enough. So it can be a little bit frustrating as a series for a new listener, but it does have benefit for a new listener, for a new fan, but it also does have benefits for existing fans, which is that the access they get. Formula One is like a notoriously sort of secretive sport, the access this Netflix series has had over its 3 seasons, each season covering 1 year of the sport, has been incredible, to be quite honest with you. Particularly the second season. I think it was the second season, taking a look at behind the scenes at Williams and their struggles. The access they had to what was going on in the background, to the factory, the offices where they were like developing the parts and stuff, and how badly disorganized the Williams Formula One team came across is pretty incredible. So as a Formula One fan, there's stuff to get out of it too, and also a lot of the Formula One is full of really interesting and entertaining characters. Like the Haas team's manager Gunther Steiner is just an absolute meme machine. Almost everything he says is memeable. He is a very funny guy, whether intentionally or not, I don't know sometimes. Daniel Ricciardo, one of the drivers, also very, very funny. So it's a really good documentary, but oh no, sorry, to finish that point. And you don't get to see those characters as much on the race weekends because you're focused on the racing, right? They're getting in the cars, they're driving around, they're not mic'd up all the time. They do interviews and stuff, but like the access you're getting here also allows you to get to know the characters behind F1 a little bit more than you do when you watch the sport itself. So again, very good documentary, lots to enjoy if you're a fan of the sport, and a very, very good introduction to the sport if you're not an existing fan. In fact, every time a new series of it comes out and someone posts about it on the subreddit for television, just r/television, there's always tons of comments like, I got into F1 through this, I don't watch F1, but I love the series. So it's good for the sport. I'm on the whole, I am on board. But I was quite frustrated at one particular episode of the series that they just put out this week. Series 3, which talks about the 2020 season, which was the COVID-affected season. It was a very exciting season of Formula One, and one of my favourite stories from the entire season, which was George Russell and switching to Mercedes when Lewis Hamilton got COVID. Not included, which was already slightly frustrating, but fine. Like, I'm not gonna, if they weren't filming, they weren't filming. If they weren't on site for that, there's nothing you can really do. So I just accepted that wasn't part of it, and that, that's a shame, but there you go. And I really enjoyed the rest of the series, but there's an episode towards the end called Man on Fire, which takes a look at one of the most horrifying crashes Formula One has ever had. I saw the race live, and my heart sank. And for a couple of minutes, until we knew the driver was okay, I genuinely was concerned I'd watch someone die on television live. It was an explosion that led to a massive fireball. Like, it was a crash that led to an explosion and a big fireball, which is so unusual in Formula One. It's actually really hard to make these cars explode the way that did. And the car was torn in half with the man still inside. Like, the glimpse we got before they cut away on the live feed when it originally aired, It's not hard to believe that most people watching thought there was a very strong chance they just watched someone die. And that is part of the drama of the sport, is that these guys are risking their lives to a certain degree for this sport they love. But one of the things I love about this sport is how it's changed over the years. And one of the things I love is the way they have incorporated safety into the sport. When Ayrton Senna died in, I think, 94, the sport made a lot of changes and continued to strive for new levels of safety. And since that time, there have only been, there's been the one death related to Formula One, Jules Bianchi. It was an unfortunately recent case, which is actually the one I saw live. And Anton Hubert, who died in F2 last year. 2019. So these two recent examples are actually surprising because there was a huge gap where absolutely no one passed away in the sport. Injured, sure. Robert Kubica had an accident that took him out for quite some time, and he was very injured. So it's still a dangerous sport, but like deaths are massively. People were dying all the time. It's easy to forget. Someone else died the weekend Ayrton Senna died in 1994. That's how frequently people were dying in the sport prior to that. But the sport has made massive strides for change and safety. New barrier technology. Protocols like having, when the race starts, because the most likely point for one of the most likely points in the race for crashes or cars to come together is the start, when they're all really close and bunched up on the grid. So they have a car that follows, a medical car that follows them for the first few turns. It's like it follows like far behind and then pulls out off the track. So it's close by should anything happen in the first couple of turns. The Halo, which is a new device that's been introduced in the last few years, very controversially, that is a steel barrier that sort of goes over the head of the driver and then around, and they say it's strong enough to take the force of I think they said at the time when it was first being discussed, you take the force of a London bus and not break, which is crazy. The idea being that if anything comes loose from a car, they a wheel comes off a car and flies into another driver, they're going to be protected from impact by an object that launches off if a car crashes, whether that be a tire or something else. And then even tire tethering technology as well. They now are required to have two tethers on each tire, so that when the cars crash, the tires will break off, but they won't go anywhere. They just made a lot of effort in the sport over the years to increase safety, and I love that. I think that's really important. And it was quite interesting when the Halo was introduced. It was a very controversial thing. People said they didn't like it. They didn't like how it potentially was obscuring the driver's visions. They thought it looked ugly on the car. And even most of the drivers were like, this isn't the answer. They were against it. There have been a couple of instances since where various drivers have been saved by this device. I forget which driver it was now, but there was a driver that one of the cars, I think it might have been Charles Leclerc for Ferrari, another car kind of collided with his and went over, and the wheel would have basically gone in the cockpit and hit his head if the Halo hadn't been there to protect him. So now we come back to Drive to Survive with all that context for people who don't know. And they do this episode Man on Fire, which is about Grosjean's crash from last year. And what I think is really upsetting is I think Drive to Survive failed F1 in that piece, because I expected them to play up the drama. I expected them to extend the shots so it looked like he was literally sat in fire for minutes and minutes and minutes, when in reality I think he got out of the car in 15-20 seconds. The audience had to wait a few minutes because they didn't want to cut back to it in case he wasn't okay. So the audience watching on TV and many of the drivers in the paddock had to wait a couple of minutes to find out he was definitely okay. But the reality was, I think someone said it was 15 seconds that he was in a fiery car and got out. minimal injuries, burned hands. I think he'd crushed one of his feet slightly, so I think he had like a fracture maybe. I remember seeing him with like a cast on, or not a cast, but like something on his foot as well. So he was clearly a little hurt, but survived and reasonably well, and was expected to make a full recovery. So that's all very good. But I wasn't shocked to see the Netflix documentary overblow that, spend many minutes using the same shot of the car burning and cutting away, and then coming back to that same shot in the hopes that you, the audience, would think he was in there for ages and ages to build up the drama. I accept that as a part of this sort of documentary storytelling. What I wasn't prepared for was that Drive to Survive would present his survival as some sort of lucky miracle. They presented his survival as he had a 0.01% chance of surviving, and isn't it incredible he walked out of that alive? And that's not what happened. The monocoque, the main sort of piece of the cockpit that he sits in, that split off from the back of the car, which is what opened the fuel engine and the fuel tank and led to all the fire, that got rammed into a barrier and was wedged between it. If the Halo device had not been in place, it would have taken off his head. Or he'd have had such an impact on his head, he would never have regained consciousness. Similar, sadly, to what happened to Jules Bianchi. The reason he gets out of the fire so quickly, and is able to, is because right behind him, within seconds of that crash happening, because they put the medical car in place, the follow sort of medical car, ready to go right at the start of the race, they were there with fire extinguishers in an extraordinary small amount of time, and they definitely helped reduce burning. I think there's a chance he'd have gotten out reasonably quickly anyway, but the fact they were aiming the fire extinguishers in the space he was trying to get out of definitely allowed for an easier, less painful escape and less burning to occur. The technology that creates the suits they wear, the many layered suits that are made from fabrics I don't understand, that protect him from fire, that kept him from not being burnt head to toe. Those are the things that saved Romain Grosjean's life. And those are the things that F1 has introduced over the years to keep these people safe and to keep this sport going. And they don't mention it at all in Drive to Survive Series 3, Episode 9. So, there's nothing that can be done about that at all. But it is one of, honestly, the most frustrating things I've ever watched. And I was actually warned that it did this before I saw it. I'm in an F1 like little text group with some people I know, and someone had said, "Oh, I've gotten to episode 9," and they act like it was a, and I was angry at the time. I was like, that's a real shame. That is embarrassing. They don't. The Halo really did. The Halo is the story, right? And that's what's frustrating is you can't even go, oh well, for entertainment value. It doesn't even work as an excuse for that, because is that not an even more incredible story to cut back to drivers, probably including Romain Grosjean, who in 2016, before they introduced the Halo, I think it was 2016, it was around that point, probably went on record and said, I don't like it, it's ugly, and now it's saved his life. Like, is that not more dramatic to include that? Does that not improve the story? That all these drivers were kind of against change, and yet this change has saved at least 2, probably more lives at this point. Yeah, it was really frustrating to watch, and I love this series, and I hope it continues. I really do, because I think otherwise it does a really, really good job. But I just couldn't not talk about that. It failed to present the incredible strides F1 has made as a sport to look after its drivers, and that is an absolute failure on the part of the production and editing of Drive to Survive. Remarkable that at no point the word Halo isn't said once. It absolutely saved his life. Yeah. And while it does obviously get to play on the emotion of him coming back out and then hugging one of the guys that ran out across the road to sort of like get to his car first with a fire extinguisher, like all those moments are wonderful and really, nice to see. And they definitely do otherwise tell the personal story of Romain Grosjean's crash. Well, even looking at the fact that as a result he didn't get to race in the race the week after, which was actually set to be his last race in F1, as his contract was expiring with his Formula One team. So they tell the story from the personal perspective, but they don't give you the context, and that is. Yeah, I found that very, very frustrating. So a bit of a weird one for a Ramblogue today. I suspect the views for this will be as low as the views for my Rocky reviews. Maybe like a handful of people will actually check it out. But it's been on my mind, and the whole point of these Ramblogues is to talk about things that are on my mind. So that's the thing that's been on my mind this week. If you're interested, if any of that sounds interesting to you, I do recommend heading over to Netflix and checking out Drive to Survive. I think it is very, very good with that choice. That single choice aside, I think it is an incredible show and it does a lot for the sport. And while it isn't perfect in other areas as well, some people talk about like the way it over sensationalizes certain things, tries to imply certain relationships with things they might not have been. It's documentary editing. I kind of accept that as a part of how you make an entertaining documentary these days. I kind of separate documentaries into two categories now. Like, is this trying to entertain me or is this trying to inform me? And if it's trying to entertain me, I tend to go a little bit more leniently on it. And I guess that's probably not the way to look at it. I think a documentary probably should be more factual than not. But I do think the balance is that I do think it is mostly factual. It's rare in Drive to Survive that they outright lie. Again, some editing to imply things that might not be there for sure. That does come up. But yeah, anyway, I am at this point rambling, and I know it's called a Ramblogue, but that's probably too much. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, everyone. I believe the first episode of Rewind Reviews is out the day after this, and obviously we'll have another Ramblogue the day after that. Possibly I'll put up the second part to I'm sure you're all excited to hear, based on the views, me talk about the subsequent 4 Rocky movies. So, but yeah, I've seen 3 of the 4. I need to just watch one more, and I'm there. Anyway, thanks for listening. I'll see you guys on the next one.